Hello everyone. This is the first recording that I'm going to make for our argumentation course. Uh, I don't want to turn the course into a lecture course exactly. It's a little bit awkward. I would like to have much more contribution from you. I think probably what we'll do is you've got the notes for the first four classes. We had the first class. Um, so I think probably the best idea is if you read through the notes for the first four classes. I will say something about those notes. So today I'm going to talk about the notes for the second class. We'll see. Maybe we'll get on a little bit further, and then possibly then we ought to arrange somehow to have a meeting where we're all online at the same time. Perhaps we'll do that through Skype. Um, it would be good if people got in touch to confirm that they're able to do that. So far, I haven't heard from any of you, so maybe I'll start writing to people individually. Anyway, for the moment, I want you to get this little bit of background in theory. So the first few classes would normally be a little bit like a lecture. So we went through the very basic stuff in the first class, and I hope you've read the uh, the notes that I gave you for that. I hope that some of you read, and or that you will read if you haven't done it yet, the very short article which I gave you the link to by Robert Fogelin, The Logic of Deep Disagreements. I'd like to just say a couple of things about that. Fogelin introduced this idea of deep disagreements, right, to explain that there are certain arguments which we can't really have because we don't have enough agreement with other people to even begin to argue. So this was quite an important idea in argumentation theory because it made people think about not just what we disagree about when we argue, but also about what we do actually need to agree on. So very basically, we need to agree on the method of discussion, the method of argumentation. We need to agree that everybody has the right to their opinion, to express what they think. And of course, that isn't always true, right? So there are parts of the world where certain people, perhaps where women would not be allowed to express an opinion, or where people who are younger than other people, right? So in certain societies, younger people are not really supposed to argue with their elders. So this can be one problem. But you can also have serious problems connected with, for example, the use of evidence. Okay, so you may be a scientific person trying to discuss something with someone who's very superstitious, and you may simply disagree on how things can be argued, right? So you come up with empirical evidence, and someone else will say, yeah, but that's not important. What's important is what the spirits tell me, or something like this, right? Um, so it's very important what Fogelin said about, not so much about disagreement, but actually about the type of agreement which is necessary, right? So there are then various theories that people talk about, that how different cultures have these different foundational or framework beliefs. Okay, so you expect that the closer somebody is to you culturally, the more likely they are to have the same kinds of framework beliefs as you, which will then make it possible to have a discussion. Okay. Fogelin kind of, during his article, at times he suggests that it's quite common, and then he sort of suggests that actually there aren't that many of such disagreements, really deep disagreements. So it's an open question in the theory whether deep disagreement is common, because we do all have slightly different framework beliefs, or whether deep disagreement is rare because, in fact, everything is open to discussion. And finally, we can discuss everything, although it might be quite difficult and it might take some effort on both sides. What it really comes down to is the fact that obviously we all have certain different beliefs, and it isn't obvious which ones are framework beliefs which are really necessary for an argument and which ones are not. But what we do know is that once we start to argue, we may end up arguing over particular facts, or the priority of one thing over another, which is fine, which is normal, and sometimes we can prove one person is right, one person is wrong. But very often, such arguments will actually lead to the discovery of these foundational differences between two people. Okay, so there is also a theory that this happens really connected with moral issues, right? So moral and ethical issues are what people disagree about. People have disagreements over values, and so what they start off with an argument which appears to be two people with simply different points of view, but who are culturally able to talk to each other. And then it turns out that as the argument progresses, that there is some sort of disagreement deep down, which leads them to have those different opinions. Okay, but you can characterize this in different ways. So one very good example of this is the debate over abortion, where it can seem as though the people on the two sides, and certainly you get a lot of examples of this in America, where they have two very, very polarized sides, right? So those who are completely against abortion and those who are, it's not right to say for abortion, but those who support abortion rights. And of course, they scream and shout at each other, and there have even been examples of shootings and explosions at clinics and so on in America. But if you actually examine the arguments, you can get down to finding out what is the fundamental disagreement. Okay, and what you discover is that it's a fundamental disagreement between those who prioritize a mother's rights to live her life as she wishes, and those who prioritize the rights of a fetus. And in fact, there are very few people who would say that either the fetus or the mother has no rights. Most people will accept that both have rights, and it's simply a question of prioritizing. So there are those who will say that the mother has the right to decide about her body, and then there are those who will say, well, the fetus is a living thing, it has the right to life. So in fact, you can say that this is a question of priorities, and how you choose that priority, or how that priority feels to you, will depend on certain factors. And you might consider those to be framework factors. So you might say, well, I can't discuss with someone who thinks like that. And certainly that can happen if people bring religion into it, because religion, people tend not to want to argue about their religion. They tend to say, well, it's just my religion, it has to be accepted. But if you leave out such sort of absolutist ideas, it should be possible for both sides of the debate to accept that actually they are basing their arguments on the idea of human rights. They are simply disagreeing about whose rights take priority. Well, when you have rights, there are always going to be clashes of rights. So it's perfectly normal within the same framework. So the idea that there are certain beliefs which we have to share in order to argue, and then there are certain beliefs which we don't have to, this division between the two is not so clear. But Voegelin's article was important because it made us think about that. It made us think about what we need to share in order to argue. Okay. So I want to move on to the second set of notes, which is titled Warrants and Schemes. Okay. So the point about these, what links these two things together. These are important developments in argumentation theory, first of all. But secondly, once we move away from formal logic, right? So formal logic has rules like mathematics, which can tell us if an argument is good or bad. Once we move away from that, there is a danger that we just end up with, well, I think this argument is good, you think it's bad, who's to say? We don't want to just shrug our shoulders and say we don't know, some arguments seem to us to be good, some arguments are bad, everything depends, everything's relative, okay? Some people like that approach, everything's relative, it depends who you are, depends on your truth, but it's a rather anti-science, anti-intellectual sort of argument, just everyone's opinion is the same. Well, It isn't. There are ways we can judge good and bad arguments, but we need some tools to do that. So these are two. Okay. So warrants. We're going to talk about a guy called Stephen Toulmin. Stephen Toulmin was a philosopher, not particularly a specialist on argumentation theory. I mean, he was writing really before argumentation theory separately became a separate field. But he wrote a book called The Uses of Argument. And he talks a lot in here about formal logic and how it's not very useful in everyday life. But he's also worried about a lack of standards in logic once logic becomes informal. But his great contribution was in looking at premises and noting that not all premises are the same, that there are different types of premises, and that different types of premises should be treated differently and should be understood differently. So that the traditional way of writing out arguments, as we saw in the first set of notes, is simply to write out premises and then a conclusion. And sometimes those premises are given names like major and minor and so on. Sometimes they're not. But they're all treated as the same type of thing. So Toulmin wants to give a little bit of better form to the way that we talk about arguments and talk about premises of arguments by pointing out that they are quite different. Okay, so the first fundamental difference in types of premise, he divides them into data premises and warrant premises. Okay, so data are facts which we give in order to support an argument. Okay, whereas a warrant is a more general kind of rule. It may also be a fact, but it's a general rule which allows us to move from the data to the conclusion. Okay. Now, very, very often in real-world argumentation, the warrant is not stated. Now, that might be because the warrant is just so well known, just so obvious that there's no need to state it, or it might be simply because if we state the data and the conclusion, then our warrant is obvious. It's obvious that there's only one way that we could have moved from the one to the other. Okay. But clearly the difference between these two is very important when it comes to arguing against this particular argument, because data we need to argue in an empirical fashion to say that this data is wrong, okay, if we want to argue. Whereas warrants, they may also be facts which we can deny, or they may be principles of reasoning which we may accept or may not accept. Okay, but that we will look at them then in a slightly different way. So if you look at in the examples that we had, I gave an example, argument 4, where John has black hair, what's black may not be blonde, John doesn't have blonde hair. Now obviously things like what's black may not be blonde, nobody ever says such warrants, right? If we say John has black hair, we don't even usually give the conclusion John doesn't have blonde hair, right? It's enough that you say, isn't John blonde? And I say John has black hair. I don't need to say, so he doesn't have blonde hair, right? So this is very, very obvious. So this is a sort of argumentation that we use in normal speech without even realizing that we're arguing. Okay. The second example is one which is based on the one that Toulmin uses, where we have an actually explicitly given rule. So we have the example, John is a British citizen. British citizens may vote in UK general elections. Conclusion, John may vote in UK general elections. Okay. So probably if you know that John is British, you would assume that John may vote because you assume that it's true that British citizens may vote in UK elections because you know something about democracy, how democratic countries work. So you probably wouldn't say that. However, the argument can get more sophisticated as we add more bits to it. So there are data and there are warrants, but there are other types of premises as well. So Toulmin also talks about qualifiers. Okay, he also talks about rebuttals, which are things which would show the argument to be false. Okay, which gives us the kind of the bigger argument that we have later on, which is argument 5a, where we say John is a British citizen. The warrant, since British citizens may vote in UK general elections, and then we have a qualifier, presumably. Okay, so we can't be certain because unless John is in prison or has lived abroad for more than 15 years, because these would be rebuttals. Right? If John is in prison, he can't vote. That's how it works in Britain. If you've lived abroad for more than 15 years, you can't vote. That's why I can't vote. So unless those things are true, then we may presumably conclude that John may vote. Okay. So what this is doing is actually including in the argument possible objections to the arguments. It's including how certain we are. Right. So here the qualifier is presumably. It could be probably. It could be almost certainly. Right. It could be anything like that. The other thing which is which he points out, right, is that warrants. Warrants may be questioned. So a warrant needs something which is called backing. Okay, so the backing for the warrant in this case would be UK law, right? UK law says that British citizens may vote unless this or this. There is a possibility that people will just ask, what's the backing for the backing? But usually it's possible to reach a backing which people would simply accept. The fact that UK elections are controlled by UK law is not very controversial, and you don't need further backing for that. Okay, so by dividing different types of premises, we know a little bit more about what the premise is doing. So normally arguments are written with at least two premises. We're going to talk later on, I think, about a different way of looking at arguments, which has been put forward by my friend Jean Wahemans, and he calls it the periodic table of arguments. You can do a search for periodic table of arguments, and you'll see some very pretty pictures. Well, I will put some information about that as well. And in his way of looking at arguments, he usually only gives one premise. So he gives one premise and one conclusion. Okay, premise leads to conclusion, and then the warrant, which he actually refers to as the lever. Okay, because it's the lever upon which the argument kind of moves. He then treats as it's the lever which allows us to identify the type of argument. Okay, and he has a very pretty picture of different types of arguments set out like the periodic table of chemicals, but it's a periodic table of arguments. It's worth looking at, and I think we'll look at that more again in the future. But this division of Toulmin has helped him to produce that. Okay. But the second thing that we want to talk about is something called argument schemes. Now, argument schemes have become very, very popular and allow us to give types of arguments. Right? So types of arguments are very important so that we don't have to analyze each argument separately as though it's right from the beginning. We can recognize different types of arguments, and then we know in which ways such types of arguments are usually shown to be true or false. Okay. Now, the thing about argument schemes is that they are usually used for informal argumentation. So it's something that we call defeasible argumentation. Defeasible argumentation being arguments which could be proved to be wrong later on. They are not logically necessary, they just appear to be true. Okay. So many of the informal argument schemes, the defeasible argument schemes, sometimes these are called presumptive reasoning schemes because we presume that things are true, but we can't be certain. Many of them have the same names as what we call fallacies. Okay, so we're going to talk much more about fallacy in the fourth part of these notes. And fallacy theory, that this is really my main area of study, so I have quite a lot to say about it, and I disagree with quite a lot of the classical understanding of fallacies. But to begin with, we'll just stick to the more traditional view. Fallacies are things which go wrong in arguments. But for something to be called a fallacy, it generally needs to be something which is it's a sort of hidden problem with an argument. So it's something which at first an argument seems to be good, seems to be persuasive, but actually there is some flaw in it, which we call a fallacy. Okay. So a lot of arguments which can be fallacious, can be fallacies, also can be good arguments, depending on the situation. Okay. So sometimes, for example, the argument from, we're going to look in a moment at arguments from expert opinion. Well, the argument from expert opinion may be a fallacy if your expert is not actually an expert, but if your expert actually is an expert, then it seems like a pretty good argument. But of course, the argument that something must be true, logically, because an expert says it's true, this is, from a formal point of view, this is fallacious, right? Just because an expert says something is true, it isn't necessarily true. However, usually, if someone is really an expert, we can trust what they say, or at least we should trust what they say, because if you don't trust experts, well, that's suggesting that you know more than the expert, and obviously, in most cases, you don't. Okay, so argument schemes, there were a few people who were kind of working on this at the beginning. I just want to mention one book, this book, okay, The New Rhetoric by Perelman and Olbrecht-Tetzer. This is an important book because it links rhetoric with logic. Okay, so previous to this, the study of rhetoric had kind of gone off to be a sort of side avenue of literature study almost. And philosophers were not very interested in it. The New Rhetoric tried to bring back together the study of argument and the study of language. And this is a very, very influential book, which was written in 1958, but as I say in my notes, it didn't actually, it was written in French. It didn't appear in English until 1969. So it's only kind of during the 70s that it began to have a slow influence on English-speaking scholars, and then only really in the 80s that it actually gets moving. So the most famous person who took this idea of argument schemes and this typology of arguments which you find in the New Rhetoric, the most famous is a guy called Douglas Walton. Douglas Walton actually died over Christmas this year. However, before that, he was a very, very prolific writer. He produced many, many, many books, many, many articles. Several of my articles are papers criticizing Walton's approach, so there are many things which I don't agree about with Walton's approach, but he was hugely influential. And finally, he produced a book along with Chris Reed and Fabrizio Macagno, who are still alive, giving a comprehensive list of argumentation schemes, and the theory behind them. So this is a very, very influential book. It's referred to in many, many papers. Okay, so in my notes there are a couple of examples taken from the book. The most important thing, so what you have in an argumentation scheme is the structure of an argument. So it looks like the way that we write out one individual argument, but it's done in a much more general way. So rather than naming somebody, okay, so we have phrases like source A asserts that A in a domain S, rather than giving a name and a particular thing that person says, right? So it's done in a very general way. And the other distinctive thing about argument schemes is that they are followed by critical questions. Now, the critical questions are the questions you should ask to discover whether that argument scheme, whether that individual argument which fits this scheme is a good argument or not. So they will generally be questions questioning those premises and questioning the move from premise to conclusion. But there are certain examples where it's a little different. So in the example of position to know, one of the critical questions is the source honest? Okay. So rather than saying, we can also question, did the source actually say what you say he said? But also, if we're interested in someone's opinion, we can also ask, is that person being honest? Can we trust that person? Okay. So this one, the argument from position to know, is fairly uncontroversial. But there's a version of that, which is the appeal to expert opinion, which is much more controversial. I've written on this. Various other people have written on this, criticizing Walton's approach, criticizing the questions and how useful they are. Because most of these questions simply ask, well, is he really an expert? Is he really a good source? Which is perhaps not that useful as a question, because usually we don't know. So there's a whole field in something called social epistemology where they talk about what it means to be an expert. So you can have a closer look in the notes at those particular questions. There are 6 questions in the basic form, but in fact, in the extended form, which Walton includes in the book I just mentioned, each question has 6, 7, 8 sub-questions going into real details about this expert's career, which I think is a little too much. Anyway, what you can see is that to some extent, the things which Walton puts in the critical questions are things which were included in Toulmin in the argument. So the kind of rebuttals that Toulmin was putting in, these are somehow included in the critical questions because, well, these are saying, instead of saying unless something is true, in the critical questions you have, is this true? And then that would defeat the argument. So it's simply a different way of doing it. Toulmin wants to include everything in the description of the argument, whereas Walton has you have the argument and then you have the questions which come later on. Okay, that's probably more or less everything I want to say about those, except I'll just say a couple of things about Walton. One of the reasons that he gets criticized, or he got criticized, now he's dead, one of the reasons his work gets criticized is that he's not very consistent. So some of his argument schemes include, such as in the conclusion here from Appeal to Expert Opinion, the conclusion is A may plausibly be taken to be true. Okay, so it includes some kind of qualifier, may plausibly be taken, whereas in the earlier one, Position to Know, the conclusion is A is true. So in the theory part, Walton writes about how these argument schemes are presumptive schemes, which may be taken to be true, but sometimes he includes that in the argument scheme, sometimes he doesn't. Also, the way that he organizes the scheme, and some of the schemes seem to be very similar to each other, and the organization is a little bit strange. So Walton's way of setting out these schemes is a little bit awkward. It's not very systematic. And that leads to some criticism. Having said that, as I said, it's still very, very influential. Walton wrote an article on almost every type of major argument, as well as a book with all of these. So argument schemes are used by everybody. So somebody like me, I often criticize Walton, but I still use argument schemes in the same structure. So it's criticizing the details of his approach, but overall this use of argumentation schemes is very, very useful. Okay. So at the end of this set of notes, there's essential reading. Stephen Toulmin, The Uses of Arguments. I mean, this is a book which is not normally available. I happen to know that if you search for it on the internet, you can find it, and you'll find that there is one chapter which deals particularly with warrants and data, which you could have a look at if you have time. Certainly you can find in the journal Informal Logic lots and lots of papers about argumentation schemes, but there is one written by Douglas Walton with David Godden, who is one of the few leading American scholars who is not at or around the age of retirement. Most of the most important scholars in America and Canada are significantly older than me, so that's pretty old. David Godden is around my age, I guess. So that's pretty young, and that's freely available. There's a link there, you can find that. Okay, so please have a read through the notes, try to have a look at part of the reading. Okay, and I'll stop for now, and then at a point in the future I'll record some comments about the next 2 sets of notes. Okay, thank you.